Therefore, the STOA panel is the right place to have that discussion. It is a topic that is central to EU policies, and we'll see in David's presentation that it also really relates to other policy areas like hydrogen, which is a very topical issue, as Dr. Eller and everybody in the ITRE committee knows. And it's also a topic, both hydrogen and e-fuels, that relate to elements that we are working on across committees. In the ITRE committee, obviously, because it's both an industrial and an energy issue. Also in the ENVI committee, where we have policies that relate to CO2 standard for cars, for instance, that have an impact, or at least where e-fuels is part of the discussion. In the transport committee, Dr. Eller mentioned aviation, obviously. In the international trade committee also, because there are possibilities of importing e-fuels from abroad. And I would also argue in the IMCO committee to make sure that I'm a bit spoiling if you don't mind, David. There is an economic rationale for producing e-fuels in Sweden and importing them in Germany, to say it like that. And finally, there is also a dimension that will not be covered by the study, but I'll be asking a question to David on that. But feel free to say no if that is beyond the scope of your work. But in the defense sector, because we know that Russia, if they attack us, they will attack our energy system. Refineries are extremely vulnerable. We see already what Ukraine has been doing to the Russian refineries with a few drones. Let's just figure what Russia can do to us with a far more potent drone fleet and missiles. And also the capacity of the Russian Navy to target oil tankers, because we import 97% of oil in Europe, mostly through boats. And so there was also a defense dimension, which will not be central to the discussion we have today. It will be more tech and economic focused, but that's something that we as parliamentarians need to keep in mind. A few words maybe about Aurora Energy Research. So it's a very renowned energy research organization. I myself, when I was a researcher for a decade on energy, I used a lot of the work that Aurora has been doing. So I'm happy to I don't know David, but I know some of his colleagues. And I'm a faithful listener of the Energy Unplugged podcast by Aurora. So if you want just to listen to some interesting energy engineering and economics debate while running or washing dishes, they have a podcast that is quite available. The report that will be presented today is not public. It's available for the Aurora Energy Research clients, but at least we'll have the slides and the lead author to talk with us. So let me introduce him. So David Olley is a senior associate at Aurora Energy Research. Is an Australian national, but living in Berlin. And David specializes in low-carbon fuels, especially hydrogen and e-fuels, which are related topics. And he has a particular focus on integration with power markets. Expertise on markets across Australia, Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe, and he has a background in quantum physics of materials. With that introduction being done, shall I give you back? No? Okay, directly to David. So the idea is that, David, if you can introduce the topic in around 20 minutes. For the colleagues, you already have the slides that David will use either on paper or in your email boxes. And after David's 20-minute presentation, we'll have an open discussion.
Thanks very much for the great introduction. Yeah, happy to take us through. I can't see the slides on this screen yet, so I'll just wait until that's happening. But just as a bit of an introduction to where we come to this topic from, so of course Aurora deals mainly with power markets across a lot of geographies, but that's sort of where our fundamental expertise lies. And through those power markets we come to green hydrogen. Of course, the greatest cost component of green hydrogen is power, and that's where we look at that from. And then, well, for e-fuels, it's in the name, electrofuels. So again, to sort of spoil things a little bit during the presentation, the main cost component of e-fuels is fundamentally power, and our modeling feeds directly into that. So that's the area, the direction that we come to here. We haven't focused on the energy security or the defense aspect of it, but I can highlight some aspects of the work that we've done that relate to this and that are important to think about in those terms. So I'll jump into it. 4 questions to focus on: where we stand currently, then on the demand side, what's driving the willingness to pay and the overall potential market size in Europe. Then looking at the supply side, which is mainly around the costs of e-fuels. And then, of course, when we come to the costs, one of the key questions that we're always asked is, how does that compare to imports? People are anxious about building up capacity to produce e-fuels in Europe if they're just going to be undercut by Brazil, for example. And then finally, we wrap it together and look at the different key levers that can be used to drive development of the e-fuel sector in Europe, particularly closing the gap between the willingness to pay and the cost, which is currently quite large. So, focusing on the first question, as was foreshadowed already, the energy crisis in 2022, I think, really changed a lot of things for people and brought into sharp focus what some important aspects that hadn't been in focus before. And energy security has driven up the agenda. Simultaneously, of course, the need to decarbonize is still there, as well as ensure energy affordability. Let's try and do all three at once if we can. E-fuels are a part of this. For certain sectors, it's actually really the only way of decarbonizing in the short term, at least. So those hard-to-abate sectors will rely on e-fuels if we're to decarbonize them. And secondly, they can reduce our import reliance on fossil fuels or other fuels. The demand for e-fuels is extremely policy dependent. So particularly Fit for 55, RED III, Refuel EU Maritime and Aviation, and the EU ETS are policies that are driving demand. Fundamentally, as we'll see shortly, e-fuels are extremely expensive, and it's going to be a while before they're coming to cost parity with their fossil counterparts. Maybe just a quick background so we're all on the same page on that, actually. So e-fuels, when we're talking about e-fuels, we're talking about drop-in alternatives to fossil fuels that are produced using renewable hydrogen and biogenic CO2 or CO2 that's been sort of captured from the atmosphere or prevented from entering it. They're low-carbon fuels, but can be used in all of the conventional ways that we use fossil fuels. Yeah, just to cover on that one. Before I move on from this slide, the part that is not shown here about the current status is that the market is currently undergoing a bit of a reality check when it comes to hydrogen. Hydrogen and e-fuels are very intimately linked. The main feedstock to producing e-fuels is renewable hydrogen, and the hydrogen industry in Europe is really, we've had a bit of a hype phase, let's say, over the last, up to about a year ago or 2 years ago. And we're coming into the reality check phase currently, where we're getting real with what projects are actually going to make it and which ones aren't. So we've seen a lot of stalled projects, a lot of cancelled projects, and not too many projects reaching FID, which is something that definitely needs to happen, especially if we're going to meet the targets set out in the Fit for 55 package. It takes about, for an e-fuel facility, it takes about 7 years to get to production from FID. So that means that we're looking at, 2032 if you take an FID now to begin production. Okay, so willingness to pay for e-fuels and the demand in Europe. So I've said already that the demand environment is driven by policy. That's because these fuels are just very expensive to produce and they can't compete on a cost basis with fossil fuels. There's the regulatory framework provided by RED III, and then there's direct policy frameworks that we can look at here. So I'd like to highlight particularly Refuel EU Aviation and Fuel EU Maritime. These are addressing sectors that are some of these so-called hard-to-abate sectors, the other ones being chemical industry, steel industry, and concrete are the main other hard-to-abate sectors. But these two transport sectors, aviation and maritime, are incredibly important and incredibly difficult to decarbonize. There are also some other policies here, which I'm not going to go into in detail, especially because we cover on them in the next slide. But the one that I'd like to point out here also is the presence of other international policy frameworks, particularly the IMO. So, of course, their recent decision on, or their recent lack of decision, let's say, on where they're going to be heading over the next years, this has been postponed, but that's an incredibly influential and important decision. And I think one can also say that it's very important to think about this with regards to international aviation bodies as well, and how they'll react to different policies. So one of the things that we have done as part of this is to look into different policies and what their maturity status is and their impact on the demand and the willingness to pay for e-fuels. The thing that I would point out here is that the most relevant or highest impact policies are the ones that are directly targeting e-fuels. So Refuel EU Aviation and Maritime both contain e-fuel specific targets, and they provide security of offtake. When we talk to clients who are looking to get financing or investment in e-fuel projects, the big hurdle that they have to overcome is offtake. Banks won't look at a project if they don't have secured offtake, and that's also the thing that's hardest to get, and also the reason why it's policy driven. So having those mandates that, having those policies that mandate e-fuel uptake as opposed to sort of generalized decarbonization really do help to provide a lot of certainty to both off-takers and producers in terms of what's going to be needed in the future. The other policies here, you know, the AFIR, what I would say about that is that infrastructure is, of course, a very important aspect of it as well, and is required for acceleration of e-fuel production within the EU, but it's also not driving direct uptake. So similar approach with the EU ETS and the CBAM. And the combustible car ban, basically our take is that for cars, the electrification of road transport is a much more attractive route. And I can talk about that more if we wish. So looking at the overall e-fuel demand potential, so this is looking at the potential market size. We came to these numbers by looking at the growth in different sectors and then the e-fuel potential penetration within those sectors. So we can see that there's a really large potential for growth, especially between 2030 out to 2050. This changes when you look at the near term or the relative near term, talking about 2030 versus 2050 and the long term. In the near term, we can see the potential e-fuel supply mix is more skewed towards e-ammonia and e-methanol. This is largely due to the influence of industry and the fact that if you're going to have a 43% reduction in the emissions from industry in 2030, then those feedstocks, ammonia and methanol, which are currently already used by industry, are going to have to be decarbonized. Looking out more towards the long term, then we definitely have e-kerosene as a very large potential market size. That's really due to it being, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the only way to do it for aviation. It really is, for the time being. For the time being, I think battery-powered planes are 5 times the weight of a hydrogen plane or of a conventional plane, and it's really puts a pin in the option for that. And direct hydrogen-powered planes are very, very, very far off, decades. What are the average costs of e-fuels in Europe, and how are they comparing to imports? So to look at this, we actually looked at 3 different scenarios for costs. I'm just going to present the base one today, but just to flag that there are different cost scenarios that you can look at. This is relevant for the defense and energy security question when it comes to how vulnerable production is to attacks and things like that, whether or not you have all of your production located on a single site or if it's spread. I'm not an expert on what the operational risks are for either of those. I guess putting all your eggs in one basket is not great, but then if you're spread out, then you also have risks to pipelines and things like that. So in the base scenario, basically we have the carbon capture and the electrolyzer co-located with the e-fuel plant. So 2 main feedstocks for producing e-fuels are the carbon that you need and the hydrogen electrolyzer. But the renewables are taken from the grid, so you don't have co-located renewables. You have a low-cost scenario if you can bundle all of that together and keep that all on site. And that then, unfortunately, you would have a high-cost scenario if you had to transport and import all of those 3 feedstocks to your site. We looked at we're showing 3 different European countries here, Germany, Spain, and Sweden. Germany, of course, is chosen as one of the biggest potential producers and one of the potential biggest off-takers as well. Spain as a sort of archetypical high solar capacity factor country, and then also Sweden, which is, as far as we've seen, basically the cheapest place to produce e-fuels. We then have, as a point of contrast, which I'll flag we didn't directly model, this is a literature value, but looking at Brazil as a point of comparison, which is, as you can see, significantly cheaper than most European production and, let's say, roughly on cost parity with Sweden. And then we also have the fossil fuel alternatives here. We can see that the base cost of the fossil fuel is very low. We can get towards cost parity with Sweden with just the CO2 cost when we look at e-methanol and ammonia. But then with e-methane and e-kerosene, we're not getting there yet. Then we look at the penalties. So in this case, we're looking at for e-kerosene, which is jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel in this case, if it's if we're talking about e-kerosene, then this is the penalty that would be laid out under Refuel EU Aviation if the targets aren't met, which you can see is very, very, very high. And then there's also the Fuel EU Maritime penalties shown here. So what we can see is that it's just very expensive to produce e-fuels anywhere, but particularly in Europe. Why is this? It comes down to hydrogen costs. So here's a sort of representative breakdown of where the costs come from. You've got the capex, which is between 1 and 20%. 1 is in the case where you already actually have the methanation plant, for example, constructed. So all of these, all of the e-fuel production facilities that we've looked at here are using existing technologies, Fischer-Tropsch process, the standard methanation processes. There's no fancy new processes there, although they do exist and are currently being researched. You've got the OPEX, which is your general kind of OPEX aspects. You've got the direct power consumption for the actual e-fuel plant itself, which is relatively low. And then you've got the cost of hydrogen. Now, the cost of hydrogen here is, we have to remember, is actually really more of a power cost. So what you can say is that the 65 to 90% of the cost of producing e-fuels is electricity costs. You also need CO2 as a feedstock, with the exception of ammonia, which you don't need carbon for. But you then need CO2 as a feedstock, and this is put here as 0 to 7%, 0 in the case of ammonia, obviously, but this is a bit of an unknown field. We know how much it costs to produce green hydrogen, but for For the CO2 feedstock, until 2041, under the current regulations, you can use CO2 captured from industry. And after that, it has to be either biogenic CO2, which means CO2 that's come as part of the natural carbon cycle, or it has to come from direct air capture. Direct air capture, of course, is another technology that is pretty nascent and also extremely power hungry, which sort of doubles down your issues with e-fuels and the cost of power associated with production. So, wrapping this together and then opening up for questions and discussion, I'd just like to show one more picture which looks at sort of the key fundamental question that is being faced by the market at the moment, which is how do we bridge the gap between the willingness to pay and the cost? So we've got this little diagram on the left here where we show the illustrative cost and willingness to pay for e-fuels, with the willingness to pay on the left-hand side here and the cost on the right-hand side. And what we want to do is we want to push up the willingness to pay and push down the cost, and that's how we're going to get to a balanced price for e-fuels. On the willingness to pay, there's penalties, subsidies, and a green premium. So, of course, some companies are willing to just pay a bit extra for the green credentials. And we do see that in the market. That is currently happening with some off-takers. But I don't think I'm telling anyone any big news when I say that that's not going to be everyone who's going to be signing up for that. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got the pull factors, which are the looking at different aspects of the sort of supply chain or the e-fuel supply chain. So we've got the CapEx support. Of course, you can just pay to build plants. That's fairly straightforward. There's feedstock and offtake subsidies, so that can come in the form of power subsidies or carbon subsidies, these kinds of things. And then also grid fee exemptions. This is one that's less talked about sort of generally within the e-fuel space, but one that we're quite focused on, seeing as we are a power company. Grid fees can actually form quite a significant cost bucket for production of e-fuels, especially seeing as you're having to really consume a lot of power, and then so that's also a great strain on the transmission grid as well, which needs to be taken into account, especially in an environment where transmission grids are already strained to breaking point almost. It's definitely a very important point of comparison. So to summarize, we've got demand that's driven by policies, which is creating incentive for e-fuel uptake, but only in the areas where it's really targeted, I would say. Imports are extremely competitive, but in Sweden, we have Sweden has very cheap green electricity. That's the fundamental reason why it's cheaper to produce it up there. So there's a competitive advantage there and a potential business case. I was talking to an e-fuels producer at a conference last week, and they basically had two areas of interest, which were Northern Europe or the Nordics and the Middle East, which is, and they skipped right over Central Europe just because it's too expensive to produce there. So closing the gap, I think, is going to take, in certain cases, maybe we can just do it with penalties. There's certainly for Refuel EU Aviation, there's high enough penalties to encourage that to happen, although there are some potential issues with that policy as well, which I'm happy to talk about. But probably I think that there's going to have to be a concerted policy effort on both the demand and the supply side to be able to prevent things like rejection of policy by industry, and also, encourage a strong uptake of e-fuel production in Europe. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Would you like to start, or I'm simply collecting members who want to start with a question? Thomas, you're going to start, and then I'm looking around. I have some questions, but please.
A quick reaction and two questions. When I was listening to you, I mean, it's quite obvious that e-fuels will always be more expensive than fossil fuels because, in a way, we need to reverse entropy, which is hard to do thermodynamically and therefore requires a lot of energy. One of the takeaways of your study is, I mean, it resonates with a lot of takeaways on energy studies. There are always unknowns, but we always come back to one central element, which is that if we want to have a competitive transformation of our energy system, we need lots and lots of cheap decarbonized electrons. And that is central if we want direct electrification with battery electric cars, whether we want to decarbonize heat with heat pumps, we want to produce cheap electrolytic hydrogen or e-fuels, we always come back to this. And this is, to me, something where the EU has been doing a lot, obviously, but like we cannot do enough on that. And this is one of the only no-regret option for us as policymakers is to do everything we can to put the greatest amount of cheap decarbonized electron on the grid, because we know that down the road it leads to cheaper everything, essentially. I've got two questions. First, do you have a tracker of e-fuel plants' final investment decision? And yes, okay. 4, okay.
And most of them are quite small.
Okay, so sorry, your mic was not on, so for the colleagues, so it was 4, and you said most, yeah?
Sorry, I just wanted to say, yeah, I think there's about 4, and most of them are about the sort of 1 megawatt scale. There's
super small. Yeah.
There's a 20 megawatt plant in Denmark.
Okay. It's something where I've been working with the president of my region, so he's a EPP, Hervé Morin. So I'm from Normandy, and so we have the big refining capacity at Le Havre. And we also have infrastructure for kerosene that is going from Le Havre to the airports of Paris, which are obviously a big consumer of kerosene. And working with him, we were quite hopeful, I would say a year and a half ago, but currently there is nothing. And I really fear, and so does he, that some companies would rather pay the penalty on refuel aviation rather than take the risk of becoming the off-takers. And to be honest, I struggle to see, at least for my country, like if it does not happen there, where we already have the refining capacity, we already have the infrastructure for kerosene, both fossil and e-kerosene, and we also have cheap electricity in that part, because we have a lot of historical nuclear and we have a lot of offshore wind power already existing and coming up. And so to me, that's kind of the canary in the coal mine, at least for Western European countries. Second and final question, can you just elaborate on the points you wanted to say on e-fuels for cars?
Yeah, sure. So looking at the aviation industry first, I think the thing that I'd like to say about that is that there is the risk that policy is going to be rejected by the aviation industry. Just simply because the penalties are very, very high. I mean, I'm not an aviation industry expert, but I don't know that their margins are that high. We looked at this at sort of as a sense check what the price impact on the cost of a ticket or a transatlantic flight would be, and it's significant. It's at least a doubling of the cost of a ticket based on that, which I think would be at least currently relatively difficult for consumers to stomach if it were passed on to them. Which is why I think also more needs to be done, not just on specific penalties for SAF uptake or not meeting those targets, but also on the supply side as well to drive down those costs, or at least subsidize those costs, so that we're not relying too much on just penalties, and furthermore being able to have that guaranteed offtake as well. As I said at the beginning, the real thing preventing a lot of these projects getting off the ground is just that they don't have customers for their product. On the cars, in general, and this kind of gets to another point about the whole e-fuels topic. In general, as we've seen, they're very expensive. There's a lot of inefficiencies. The round trip efficiency is 20-something%, right, for energy in to energy out. It's very, very, very low, depending on the e-fuel and the process and all of these kinds of things. Really, the sectors where it makes sense to talk about e-fuels or to introduce e-fuels are the ones where you don't have another option. So maritime, steel, aviation, these kinds of hard-to-abate sectors are the ones where, A, there's no other option, and B, it's, if we're going to decarbonize it, this has to be the way. The alternative is you don't have an aviation industry. That's the alternative. So I think that when we're looking at where policies need to be targeted and where they need to be brought to, it needs to be those industries where direct electrification isn't an option. And for cars, it is.
So I think you've kind of replied to questions that I've had. Perhaps I'll just read out one thing. And thank you, by the way, for your presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
Ana Vasconcelos from Portugal and Renew Europe. In relation to upcoming revision related to hydrogen in the production of e-fuels for the 2021-2027 period, hydrogen-related projects in the EU are estimated to receive 18.8 billion of funding, mostly from public money and grants. Just to give an example, Spain is the front-runner country in hydrogen investments, putting 400 million national scheme to co-fund hydrogen production projects. As you mentioned, many projects are at early stages rather than... So does the re-inclusion of e-fuels in the 2035 CO2 targets, as the EC is reconsidering, is it realistic for the reasons mentioned in the presentation and mainly regarding scaling up problems? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. A lot of funding has been awarded, particularly through the European Hydrogen Bank auctions. What we've seen in those auctions is that companies have been bidding at very, very, very low levels, and levels that are very, very ambitious, let's say. And there have also been there's been quite a significant dropout rate from those auctions. So I think they're having to re-release the results of the latest auctions because so many people or so many companies have dropped out when push actually came to shove and they had to really build their plant with such a low level of subsidies. So it is just very expensive. And the second part of the question, sorry, was to do with the reintroduction of e-fuels targets into that. I think that e-fuels does drive demand, but it's a secondary effect because we have hydrogen demand that gets driven by e-fuels, but then the demand for those e-fuels is policy driven. So I think that on the first level, yes, and then the second level, it comes down to how we want to encourage the decarbonisation of different industries. And I'd go back to what I said before about the industries that need e-fuels as a way of decarbonising. I know that definitely, so in the latest round, there was the latest round of EHB auctions, there was a specific maritime topic. I think that was 400 million that was awarded to specifically projects that had a maritime off-taker, and that, of course, cleared a bit higher as well. So it's definitely, the demand is there, it has an effect, but again, it's policy-driven.
Herbert and then Nicolas.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Well, I agree with the colleague, everything starts with the electron. And in Europe we have less than 1 out of 2 electrons available are sustainable ones. So and for sure, as you mentioned, the case of Sweden, we have cases and situations and regions where we have more sustainable electrons as we need. So, but this is mostly a problem of the lacking grid. It's not a problem that the electron is not needed. It's a problem that we cannot transport it. So I'm asking myself, given that e-fuels have, as you said, an efficiency more or less of 20%, an electric car, battery electric car, has an efficiency of 90%. So what the hell? I'm saying, does it make any, does the political debate we are having here about neutrality on technology, does it have any sense? Or the other way around, wouldn't it make more sense to try to use the available sustainable electrons, so electricity, for all technologies which can go directly in the grid, so heat pumps, or where battery is possible, like cars or trucks maybe, or buses. And only once we will have too many sustainable electrons available, we can start to think about using these electrons for other things like aviation or ships, because I think if we have an overlook on all the CO2 emissions, what is the sense to use a technology to produce unsustainable electrons and then use a technology with a 20% efficiency only to say I have then an e-fuel for a plane? Doesn't it make much more sense to use oil or kerosene or whatever for this plane? So sometimes I have the impression we are a bit looking at these silos, but we are not looking at the overall picture of the whole thing and the overall CO2 emissions and the overall possibilities where we can really use available sustainable electricity and where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for it. If I could snap my fingers and make an e-fuel industry pop off the ground in 1 month, then I would say, yes, let's do this, and I'll do that finger-snapping exercise in 20 years. But I think that, so fundamentally, yes, you're right. The efficiencies mean that direct electrification is actually the most efficient way to save carbon currently. But the issue is that we do have these industries that are very, very difficult, nigh on impossible to decarbonize without the use of these kinds of fuels. So I say these kinds of fuels, I mean e-fuels, but I'm also including hydrogen in that. So hydrogen is the main way for the steel industry. If we're going to decarbonize these industries as well, there needs to be some lead in time. So, for example, in Germany or Germany and the Netherlands, there's a lot of talk about building what's called the core hydrogen network, which is partial new build, partial replacement of gas pipelines in order to create a hydrogen transmission network within Central Europe. And this piece of infrastructure would be quite, well, very, very important for building a hydrogen economy. And when I say hydrogen economy, also that includes e-fuels, really. That's not going to happen overnight. And so my counter-argument, well, firstly, I would acknowledge, yes, on a case-by-case basis, you do want to use those electrons for direct electrification. But in a more holistic sense, we do also want to be able to help this industry take off for the purposes of decarbonizing those hard-to-abate sectors. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for this study. I think it's important. For me, it was very, very nice to see that two of the main legislations that are pushed for e-fuels are the RED and refuel aviation. I have the opportunity to work on both, so it's a pleasure for me. But anyway, when we were discussing these policies, we always think in e-fuels for these sectors hard to abate, always. We didn't have in mind, for example, for cars, for road transport. But because there is an upcoming debate on that, and it was mentioned by Thomas and for Dorman, that electrification is probably cheaper. But at the same time, if you call for the use of e-fuels on cars, and at the same time, you call for a reduced or a softer landing of ETS2, of course you are not pushing for e-fuels, because you don't want to push them with ETS2, is going to be impossible to have enough e-fuels for road transport by 2035. This is, I think that, but I think I want you to comment this is possible. But one thing, you make a projection here in one of the slides about the pricing of in different countries. Taking into account that electricity costs probably are the main driving of pricing, but which other components, what did you take into account to make this projection? And the other thing is electrolyzers. Electrolyzers, we had two possibilities, mainly two possibilities, also a third one, but when the investors in hydrogen are deciding which technology take, they have mainly two options, Chinese or European. They say Chinese is cheaper than European, but you don't have warranties of maintenance for the whole period of that, you have a problem. And they used to take sometimes European because, okay, it's less affordable, but they have maintenance. How do you solve this in your study? Did you take into account this issue? And thank you so much for the study that I will take into account because it's very worthy.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so what goes into the cost? So we've got hydrogen costs, carbon costs, with the exception of e-ammonia, which doesn't need hydrogen. It needs nitrogen, which is taken into account in that case. Power costs, we assumed a 25-year economic lifetime of the plant. You've got also the other cost component or key cost component is how much it's running. So what proportion of the year it's running. This also comes into the grid question as well, because there's a lot of talk about using electrolyzers as flexible demand-side response. But this has a lot of also negative effects, A, on the business case, because you're producing, if you're providing flexibility to the grid, you're producing less of your product. And then also it degrades the electrolyzer a lot faster, and certain types of electrolyzers are better at ramping than others. And, you know, on that topic, when we talk to people who want to have flexibility as a line item on their financial models, they're all about it. And then when you talk to the people who are actually going to be operating the electrolyzers, they really don't want that to happen. Yeah, and then the COPEX, the APEX, the OPEX and the CAPEX, of course, and then the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, is the other sort of main cost parameter that we considered. When it comes to the things like the maintenance of electrolyzers, we didn't consider that explicitly. We have, at Aurora, we have a sort of hydrogen research team as well, where we produce reports based on hydrogen, and there we have standardized assumptions about electrolyzer costs, also the future direction of electrolyzer costs, which we combine with our forecasts about electricity costs that then inform what the sort of average cost of hydrogen will be in the future according to our forecasts. And that's what really determines what the hydrogen cost that we use in production of these products is. And yeah, just the other thing to say about that, there are slightly different ideal plant setups in different countries as well, which we also considered. So one of the main aspects of producing green hydrogen, of course, is that you need to have you need to be certified, and you need to ensure temporal correlation and things like that. And that's easier or more difficult depending on the country. So Sweden already has, or northern Sweden, where we looked at, has already a green grid, so that makes it both easier and cheaper to produce green hydrogen there. Germany is a different story. Thanks.
My questions would be twofold. First of all, you had been referring a little bit on the, let's say, the framework conditions, so on the permitting, but also on the infrastructure question. I mean, have you considered the example you had been giving with the Paris airport? I mean, we have simply one refinery which is supplying the Berlin airport, and that's Schwedt. So if Schwedt is closed, there is no way besides trucks to get kerosene or whatever kind of nature of have you considered what would be the needed, let's say, infrastructure investments? Because I mean, the efficiency goes, I mean, simply falls to the bottom if we are going to transport that by cars. So is there an overview for the aeronautic industry what infrastructure investments would to be made? And then if you look to the refineries, I mean, the number of refineries are permanently going down in Europe by the logic of our exercise. But to some extent, or to what extent, this infrastructure question is really, let's say, cost relevant, and what would be the dimension of that? My second question, but that's more referring to us. I think that in terms of the permitting, since we are doing these omnibuses vertically, so we look about forest economy, and rightly so, but we don't have a horizontal idea about permitting, because I mean the discussion serves individual industry on their costs, but not the overall. I mean, if I see now that the energy omnibus is totally disconnected from the environmental omnibus, I think we might not be able to reduce permitting costs. But that is more a reference to our discussion. What I would like to know about you, I mean, you calculated the cost, but I mean, if there would be a market, I mean, you have the economics of scale up popping in at a certain point, and since you're calculating the energy costs obviously very high for the moment, I think for the start that makes that almost, I mean, that's might be the biggest challenge. But in perspective, I mean, at least if we somehow believe what we had been starting, we would see that energy costs would go down. So what is your projection over the next, let's say, 15 years? To what extent the economic of scale are kicking in and also reflecting the lower energy prices? Because if you talk, for example, about hard to abate and our discussion about the 90% is pretty much based on carbon sinks. So in a way, I mean, either we don't believe at all in what we are speculating about, or we believe to some extent that energy costs are going down, and then, let's say, extraction from the air or carbon sinks will be somehow plausible. So what's the economics of scale in terms of projection? And my last question would be, I mean, the question is, I mean, the RED assumes that we, by a regulatory framework, we reach a certain level of production in Europe. But, I mean, realistically, if we look now to Chile, the ITRE committee had been in Chile. I mean, it seems to be that the costs for e-fuels to produce in Chile might be dramatically lower than in Europe. So, I mean, is our strategy to have a static assumption of what then the RED would bring? And realistically, we have all that challenges. So what about, or how realistic would be the supply from simply outside the EU? Because it might be that simply that's not our economic model to produce e-fuels in Europe with the given cost structures. So, I mean, they're also staring to us in terms of market demand. But what would your projection, I mean, is it then the other way around, that we're pretty much saying, okay, that we are not going to achieve in Europe, or just for the security for supply or some kind of resilience, which is driving the costs upwards yet again. But how realistic do you see the security supply by producing that outside the European Union? Because I think I can't imagine that we're not going to fly in Europe anymore from 2030.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I think they're all actually quite related and a lot dependent on the infrastructure question. I mean, I think the first question I interpret, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically what is the cost impact of infrastructure? I think I view infrastructure really as an enabler. So when we talk about being able to produce e-fuels, it's reliant on having hydrogen, which could come from the pipeline. It's reliant on being able to store that hydrogen, which could happen, A, in the pipeline, B, in underground caverns. The risk here is that there is, in terms of infrastructure, there's a competition between different products. So you already have a competition between hydrogen transportation and natural gas for pipelines. And then you also have a competition for the storage of those. And this is probably the biggest challenge and therefore the biggest cost aspect that would need to be overcome, particularly when it comes to natural gas and hydrogen transportation, because you can't, you have to choose a date at which you're switching over that hydrogen, or that pipeline to hydrogen. But then, of course, you also have to have all of the off-takers on that pipeline who are currently off-taking natural gas. You have to convince them that they want to be off-taking hydrogen instead, or they need to shut down. So that's the biggest risk that I see on the infrastructure front. You know, the e-fuel plants can be located at the site of existing refineries. And I think a lot of companies who are running refineries are looking at this question of, do we want to be producing e-fuels as well? And then, of course, the e-fuels themselves are chemically indistinguishable from the fossil fuels, so you can have partial blending and things like that. The other aspect on the aviation regulation question is, of course, do you want to have the option to produce e-fuels in foreign countries and simply refuel the planes in those foreign countries and have that count towards the European targets as well, if there's some kind of booking scheme? And I don't know what the state of that kind of idea is at the moment. The economies of scale, for the plants that we looked at, these were almost entirely existing technologies. So that have been around for decades. So technological learnings wasn't a big impact there. Those technologies are sort of already at scale too. For the actual production of the e-fuels, that is. For the hydrogen electrolyzer component, of course, there are going to be reductions in the costs of hydrogen electrolyzers. But again, this is a question for what happens in China and what happens there. I know a lot of people in the energy industry often look towards the story of solar photovoltaics and kind of hope and pray that something like that is going to happen for electrolyzers. But at least this is my personal take, that I think that solar PV is the exception to the rule rather than the rule with those kinds of things. So and then of course, to have those economies of scale, that's when you do also really need that infrastructure to be online, to have those pipelines, to have those storage facilities. And a decision needs to be made, whether it's by the market or by policymakers, about what we're going to be using that infrastructure for, because there's already large existing pipelines. There's plans to build hydrogen-specific pipelines. Is it going to be used for natural gas? Is it going to be used for hydrogen? Is it going to be used for carbon? That's the other. You've got three feedstocks that are all competing. And this is also what makes it a potentially more attractive business proposition to have all three of those things co-located so that you're not facing that competition. And how realistic is it to supply from outside the EU? So we looked at the transport costs for the various e-fuels, and compared to the cost of production, they're very low. There's already, for methane, for example, there's already an LNG international transports. That's already in operation. It's already happening, of course. There's also transportation of methanol and ammonia. These are both more dangerous to transport. Neither of those are particularly pleasant chemicals to be around. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the transport infrastructure does exist. We know how to transport it, and they are much more energy-dense fuels than hydrogen. So direct shipping of hydrogen, of course, is a very difficult cost proposition, especially if you want to try and liquefy it or compress it. And one of the other uses of e-fuels, particularly ammonia, actually, is as a hydrogen carrier as well, apart from supplying existing markets for those products. So I think it is realistic, at least technologically speaking, to supply from outside the EU. I think the question that needs to be asked when it comes to that, though, is certification. So if it's really the case that we want to make sure that the e-fuels are green and are produced using green hydrogen and that are produced using biogenic CO2, for example, then, of course, it's a lot easier for the EU to make sure that that's happening within Europe's borders rather than relying on certification of foreign countries where there could be some carbon leakage.
So, colleagues, I mean, besides that I'm pleading for mercy for my 1960s Porsche, who will be heavily dependent on e-fuels, but I mean, CO2, if I see the full CO2 circle, my 1960 Porsche might be the most efficient car ever been on the streets. But anyway, thank you very much. If colleagues don't have additional questions, I think that's a very helpful discussion. To be honest, I mean, it reminds me a little bit about the variation of the old saying, complexity kills the cat. But I mean, we have to tackle that. That makes, I mean, the discussion on the grid even more relevant, what we're going to do. I mean, if there is no hydrogen pipeline between Spain, France, and Central Europe, I think, I mean, the idea that we get that by ships, I think it's absolutely nuts. So in a way, there's a lot of components. But I think realistically, since I think politically we wouldn't survive that the Europeans are not going to fly anymore, I think we should also look for external sources, and we have to solve the problem, because it's a liar's poker that we pretend that we would have an answer for the aeronautic sector till 2030, how to get rid of 55% CO2 reduction, because technology is not available, so it will be the fuel. And I think that will be the first sector where it becomes so obvious right now that the trajectory are not really really realistic. If you see that if we would start to invest now, we would have the plants in the early 2030s at best. So in a way, thank you very much. I think that would be very helpful. We are going to send that to the committees. I encourage colleagues also to refer in the committees to that, because it's really something we can build on the grid discussion, which is going to come in ITRE and other files. Thank you very much for Thomas for just suggesting that. Thank you for coming here to the European Parliament, the thousands on the screen. And that leads me to tell you that the next meeting is on the 27th of November. And please, I mean, I haven't said that, and I don't want to get on your nerves, but I had been mentioning the workshops, the ERC pairing schemes, and the date for the lecture. And it would be very nice that that you join, because it would be then a little bit humiliating for the ones organizing that the organizers are there, but the rest of STOA isn't. And in terms of the ERC grantees, I mean, we have really distinguished colleagues from the scientific sectors who take an interest in our work, so it would be very kind that since we do that together with the ERC for the first time, that that you would show up also on the gathering. Okay, having said that, thank you very much, and see you next week.
This proposal.
But he prepared